A 13-year-old boy was abducted by his neighborhood's HOA and abandoned 250 miles from home for laughing too loud. At the heart of it all stood Patricia Griffin, a polished community leader who decided some children simply didn't belong. But what she didn't know was that Jaden's father, Kevin Bryant, wasn't just any parent. He was a federal prosecutor with a moral fire she couldn't silence. And just wait until you see how this quiet suburban nightmare turned into a nationwide reckoning. And why justice didn't just knock, it kicked the door down. Kevin Bryant didn't rattle easily. He was a former military prosecutor, a widower, and the kind of man who carried himself with quiet steel. When others complained, he acted. When others hesitated, he moved forward. But nothing in his years of courtroom battles or classified briefings had prepared him for what happened that evening. His 13-year-old son, Jaden, hadn't come home from the school trip, and something in Kevin's chest knew, even before he picked up the phone, that this wasn't some innocent delay. The moment the line connected with Mr. Dalton, the 8th grade history teacher, Kevin's voice was a low, clipped demand. "Where's my son?" There was silence, just long enough to confirm Kevin's worst instincts. Then Dalton's voice broke through, shaky, thin. We got back about 20 minutes ago, Mr. Bryant, but Jaden isn't here. The HOA asked that he stay behind." Kevin's grip on the phone tightened. "The HOA did what?" the teacher stammered. "There was an incident. They said Jaden violated the neighborhood's internal code of conduct. Something about him, laughing too loudly in front of their office. They claimed it was disruptive, inappropriate behavior for a public-facing space." Kevin's pulse roared in his ears. And then what? Dalton hesitated, as if weighing which part was worse, the truth or admitting he hadn't stopped it. "They called one of their contracted transport units, a van, said they'd handle it, and they took him. I thought they had contacted you." Kevin didn't hear the rest. He was already moving, already scanning his mental map of the city and surrounding counties. They took him, without permission, no school staff present, no guardian, no legal authority. A private homeowners association, essentially a neighborhood management company, had taken it upon themselves to detain his son and transport him to an unknown location. His son. For a laugh, Kevin stood frozen for a full 5 seconds, not out of confusion, but fury. Cold, focused, legal fury. The kind of fury that makes men in courtrooms look down and forget how to speak. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was abduction dressed in khakis and committee charters. And it had been done under the banner of community standards, as if that gave them the right. Kevin's mind was already calculating statutes: federal, state, civil, criminal, parental rights, transportation of minors, unlawful detention. He wasn't just a father right now. He was a loaded weapon of legal precision, and someone, multiple someones, were about to find out exactly what kind of mistake they'd made. They thought Jaden was just another kid with no one watching. They had no idea who his father was. It took 14 grueling hours to find Jaden. 14 hours of silence, darkness, and spiraling fear. 14 hours where every minute carved itself into Kevin Bryant's memory like a blade. He had torn through the HOA office with nothing but questions and stone walls. They refused to give names. They refused to admit what they'd done. But they knew. They all knew. Kevin saw it in the way the receptionist's hands trembled as she shuffled paperwork that didn't need shuffling, in the way the manager avoided eye contact, in the way no one asked the obvious, "Have you called the police?" Because deep down, they understood exactly how wrong this was. Jaden had vanished. Not wandered off, not missed the bus. Vanished, delivered into the unknown by a private organization with zero oversight. And they expected Kevin to wait quietly, to let them investigate their own actions. But Kevin wasn't just a father. He was a former military prosecutor with a war chest of contacts, resources, and zero tolerance for bureaucratic games. He didn't knock. He demanded. He didn't beg. He threatened. With precision, with calm, with language that made even the smug legal counsel in his expensive suit start to sweat. And then, at 3:17 a.m., the call came. A patrol unit with the California Highway Patrol had found a minor, male, black, about 5'6", alone on the side of I-5 just outside Bakersfield. No ID, just a dead phone, and a school-issued backpack. Kevin's tires screamed on the asphalt as he crossed 3 counties in record time. His body ran on nothing but rage and caffeine, and by the time he reached the site, the rising sun had begun to cast long, bloody shadows across the edge of the highway. Jaden was sitting in the dirt, knees pulled to his chest, shoulders hunched like the world had tried to fold him in on himself. His skin was red and raw, blistering from the sun. His lips were dry and cracked, his eyelids fluttered with exhaustion, and his hands, God, his hands, trembled as they clutched his backpack like it was the only thing in the world that hadn't abandoned him. There was no water bottle, no insulin, no protection. Kevin's boots hit the gravel hard as he crossed the final stretch, knelt in front of his son, and said nothing. Just looked. Just breathed. Just memorized the sight of him to bury the terror clawing up his throat. Jaden looked up slowly. His eyes widened. Not in fear, not in relief, but in a kind of dull, stunned disbelief. Like he wasn't sure if what he saw was real. "They said I was embarrassing the neighborhood," Jaden whispered, voice barely audible over the hiss of passing on trucks. "I was just laughing. I was happy. They didn't like that." Kevin couldn't speak. "They said I was disrupting the image of the community. One of the ladies called me a reflection of what happens when we stop enforcing standards." He swallowed hard, blinking fast. "Then they put me in a van. It had the HOA logo. I asked where we were going, but nobody answered. I thought maybe they were taking me home, but then they stopped. Middle of nowhere. They opened the door, told me to get out, and said someone would find me." Jaden wiped his nose on his sleeve. "Nobody did." Kevin felt his jaw lock, teeth grinding so tight it ached. Jaden had type 1 diabetes, a single drop in his blood sugar, and he could have collapsed, gone into a coma, died, alone, confused, scared, in a ditch off the freeway. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was targeted, coordinated, intentional cruelty. Kevin didn't cry. Not then, not there. He just reached out, wrapped his arms around his boy and held him, gently but firmly, like anchoring him back to the world. But inside something broke. And what came next would make damn sure the people responsible would never do this to another child again. The next morning, the sun rose on a different man. Kevin Bryant wasn't trembling anymore. He wasn't grieving or searching or begging for cooperation. He had done that. He had burned through every layer of desperation in a single night. What remained was something colder, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. Resolve. He stepped into the HOA administrative office at 8:03 a.m. sharp. The doors opened with a soft chime, but the room fell silent as if thunder had cracked overhead. He wore a black suit, simple, crisp, federal. In his right hand was a worn leather briefcase that had once sat beside him in courtrooms from DC to Afghanistan. In his eyes, ice, pure and unmoving, the kind of stare that cuts through lies before they form. No one greeted him. He didn't wait. He walked straight to the reception desk, placed his case on the counter, opened it slowly, and pulled out a manila folder thick with documentation, screenshots, and legal codes annotated in red ink. "My name is Kevin Bryant," he said flatly. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It had the weight of inevitability. "I'm a federal prosecutor." Then he leaned in just slightly, just enough. "And I'm not here as a father. I'm here as your worst nightmare." The receptionist blinked, startled. Behind her, a junior administrator fumbled a coffee cup. Someone's phone buzzed nervously on a nearby desk, unanswered. Kevin continued. "This office, this governing body, authorized the unlawful detainment and interstate transportation of a minor. That minor is my son. He was taken without parental consent, placed in an unmarked van operated by a third-party vendor contracted under this association, and abandoned 250 miles from his legal residence without water, medical aid, or communication access. The fact that he is still alive is no credit to you. It is a statistical miracle." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I am formally requesting, under federal legal authority, the following. All video surveillance from the front office and parking lot between the hours of 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. yesterday, the full name and employment status of the van driver, all internal memos or communications regarding behavioral enforcement involving minor residents, and a copy of your transportation contract with Omega Private Logistics, or whichever shell company you used to launder this human rights violation. The receptionist opened her mouth, closed it again. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed shut. Kevin looked at his watch. You have 45 minutes to comply before I subpoena every record from your server, freeze your accounts, and make this building uninhabitable with search warrants and media vans. And I suggest, he added, tilting his head just slightly, you start with the truth. By noon, Kevin had already spoken with a federal judge, an old colleague from his days in military justice, who didn't ask many questions once he saw the photos. The legal motion was immediate. A temporary injunction against the HOA's enforcement division, an emergency review by Child Protective Services, and most importantly, a multi-agency investigation was triggered within 48 hours. Charges began to line up like dominoes: unlawful imprisonment of a minor, violation of federal civil rights under Title 42, endangerment of a child, transportation of a juvenile across county lines without legal consent, and aggravated neglect resulting in potential medical harm. Kevin didn't blink. This wasn't vengeance. This was law, applied like a blade. What Kevin uncovered in the following days went far beyond Jaden. At first, it seemed isolated, an overreach, a one-time abuse of power by a few overzealous HOA board members. But the deeper he dug, the darker it became. Beneath the carefully manicured lawns and beige stucco facades, there was a quiet, deliberate system, a pattern of removals masked as community protection. No paper trails, no records, no formal write-ups, just whispers, unspoken directives, and kids who suddenly vanished from the neighborhood without explanation. It turned out Jaden wasn't the first. He wasn't even the third. Over the past 18 months, there had been at least 5 similar incidents, teenagers labeled as disruptive, difficult, or visibly aggressive, which, in HOA parlance, meant they laughed too loudly, dressed differently, or simply didn't fit the aesthetic. Each time, those teens were removed under vague violations of neighborhood standards, relocated without notice, and left miles away under the assumption someone else, someone more responsible, would deal with them. And presiding over all of it? Patricia Griffin, HOA director, polished, soft-spoken, always dressed in pastel sweaters and pearl earrings. She had built a reputation as a guardian of order. To her supporters, she was a pillar of community integrity. To those who dared challenge her authority, she was something else entirely. Kevin assembled the evidence with surgical precision. Testimonies from frightened teens, GPS data from contracted transport vans, emails with language so clinical in tone, it made the implications even more chilling. We've neutralized the issue. Relocation complete. Intervention successful. Within 72 hours of his motion being filed, warrants were issued for the arrest of 3 HOA board members and Griffin herself. When officers arrived at Patricia's home, she refused to come to the door. Curtains drawn, doors locked. Her voice, muffled but unmistakable, shouted from inside, "You don't understand. We were protecting the community. We were upholding our standards." As officers breached the door, body cam footage captured her final defense, one she didn't intend to be heard. "We don't need children who look unstable," she hissed, her voice tight with fury. "They don't belong here." That clip, less than 15 seconds long, hit TikTok before sundown, and by sunrise, it had detonated across social media. Patricia Griffin was no longer a respected HOA figure. She was #Karen the Kidnapper. The hashtag dominated trending charts. Clips of her arrest, played side by side with videos of Jaden alone on the highway, set to dramatic music, captions demanding justice, and stitches from angry parents nationwide. "I live in an HOA," one woman said tearfully into her phone, "and now I'm terrified what they could do to my kid if he steps out of line." News outlets picked it up within hours. CNN, MSNBC, local affiliates, each ran with the headline, "HOA director arrested after child dumped 250 miles from home." Protesters began showing up outside the HOA's main office, holding signs that read, "Not a neighborhood, a prison," and "This is what HOA tyranny looks like." Kevin watched it unfold with grim clarity. This wasn't just a criminal case anymore, it was a reckoning. Griffin's carefully curated image shattered overnight. And the board members who had once walked around with clipboards and smug grins were now facing years in federal prison. But perhaps the most devastating blow to them wasn't legal, it was social, because now the world was watching. And the masks they wore in public, those of protectors, guardians of peace, were gone. They weren't heroes. They were kidnappers in khakis, and no HOA policy manual could save them now. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers, reporters, and HOA officials, but with parents, teachers, veterans, teenagers who had once lived in fear of silent punishment for speaking too loud, dressing too bold, or simply existing outside the comfort zone of those who claimed to protect the neighborhood. Every seat was filled, every eye fixed on the man who now stood before the bench. Not as a grieving father, but as a citizen willing to challenge something much larger than a single policy or board. Kevin Bryant rose slowly as the judge called on him. He didn't adjust his tie. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't need to. The room, already tense, seemed to lean forward in collective silence. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm but grounded, "I ask that the record reflect one thing clearly. I am not seeking compensation. I am not requesting special protection. I'm not even here today in the role I've spent my career mastering. I'm not here as a prosecutor." He let that breathe for a second. "I am here as a father, yes. But I am also here as something more. I am a citizen of this country. A country where no child, regardless of how they look, laugh, or live, should be dragged into the back of a van for violating someone's definition of quiet enjoyment." He glanced toward the defense table, toward Patricia Griffin, who sat with folded hands and a blank stare that had long since lost its self-righteousness. "This isn't about my son anymore. This is about every child who was told they were too much, or too loud, or too visible. Every family who felt the icy grip of a system that hides behind fine print and bylaws to justify fear, exclusion, and unchecked control." Kevin turned back to the judge. The HOA did not just overstep. They abandoned their humanity. They turned community guidelines into weapons. They forgot that power without accountability is tyranny, even when it's dressed in a cardigan and couched in polite HOA language. He stepped closer to the podium, eyes blazing, not with anger, but with unshakable clarity. "We speak often about freedom. We defend the Constitution. But if we allow private governance to override basic civil rights, especially the rights of our children, then we've already surrendered something much more important than control. We've surrendered our conscience." He paused, and the courtroom felt utterly still. "So today, I'm not asking for retribution. I'm calling for responsibility, because this case isn't an outlier, it's a warning." And with that, Kevin sat down. No flourish, no grandstanding, just the quiet, forceful end of a speech that would echo far beyond the walls of that courtroom. He didn't just win the case. The verdict was unanimous. All charges upheld. The HOA's leadership formally removed. Patricia Griffin sentenced to federal prison. But what followed was something even larger. Kevin's statement went viral within hours. It was shared by legal scholars, civil rights advocates, and parents across all 50 states. Clips of his courtroom speech were replayed on every major news network, dissected in op-eds and education roundtables. Senators began referencing the Bryant case in committee hearings. Within weeks, Kevin was invited to Washington, not for recognition, but for collaboration. He co-authored the first draft of what would become the Community Accountability and Protection Act, a federal initiative to regulate the reach of private homeowners associations, particularly their authority over minors. The act mandated transparency, restricted punitive authority, and, most importantly, barred any HOA from removing or detaining children under any circumstances without immediate parental consent and state oversight. What began as one man's nightmare became the nation's wake-up call. Kevin never sought the spotlight, but in refusing to protect just his own name, he helped protect millions more. And in doing so, he proved something most people forget. You don't need a badge to make change. You just need a voice that won't stay silent. In the days following the verdict, Jaden's world changed, not through fanfare or flashing cameras, but through envelopes. The first letter arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, just a few words in shaky handwriting. "You don't know me, but you made me feel seen." No name, no explanation. But it was enough. Then came more. Dozens, then hundreds. Letters, drawings, care packages. Notes from kids who had been silenced, from parents who had been powerless, from veterans, teachers, and neighbors who had all lived under the silent control of HOA rules they'd never dared to question. Until now. Some shared stories of playground bans, lemonade stands shut down, or flags torn down by order of community preservation. Others simply said thank you. A few just sent stickers or toys, little offerings to a boy who had become something larger than himself. One package from Texas held a folded drawing by an 11-year-old boy, Jaden, in a superhero cape, towering over shadowy monsters labeled HOA. Above the words, "Jaden versus the HOA monsters, victory of the light." Jaden stared at it for a long time, then taped it above his bed. He began organizing the letters by state, filling boxes and walls with voices that had, for too long, been ignored. One note from a Marine read, "They fined me for flying my flag. You reminded me why I never stopped." At school, whispers turned into greetings. Classmates gave him high fives. Someone slipped a note into his locker. "You helped my cousin. Thank you." A few students started a justice club in his name. Jaden didn't lead it. He didn't need to. His story already had. But through it all, Jaden stayed grounded. He still played video games, still left his shoes in the hallway, still hated doing homework. But now, when he laughed, he didn't lower his voice. He didn't look around nervously. He just laughed, and in that sound, pure, free, unapologetic, lived everything they tried to take from him, and everything they failed to break. The sentencing of Patricia Griffin drew a full gallery. Rows of journalists, community members, angry parents, and silent former allies packed into the courtroom, all waiting to hear what would become of the woman who, for years, had ruled over the neighborhood like an invisible queen, quietly powerful, unchallenged, and, as it turned out, terrifyingly unaccountable. Patricia sat in her chair with hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture ramrod straight, her pearls still clasped at her neck as if she could keep up the image one last time. But her eyes betrayed her. There was no defiance left, no speeches about standards or community integrity, just the pale look of a woman who had spent the past 6 weeks watching the walls around her world collapse, brick by silent brick. The judge reviewed the charges slowly, with precision. Unlawful detainment of a minor, reckless endangerment, transportation of a child without parental consent, civil rights violations, conspiracy, obstruction. The totality of harm inflicted, physical, emotional, systemic, was staggering. And it wasn't just about Jaden. It was about the pattern, the silence, the cold-blooded design behind every removal. Patricia's legal team had argued for leniency, citing her age, her lack of prior criminal record, her years of community service. But the prosecution dismantled it in minutes, pointing out that her version of service had been shaped by fear, control, and a deep aversion to anyone who didn't fit her narrow image of acceptability. At last, the moment came. The judge looked down from the bench, adjusted his glasses, and spoke. "Patricia Griffin," he said, voice firm but even, "you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, no parole eligibility for at least 7. You will also be subject to a lifetime ban from holding office in any housing authority, civic board, or private governance structure involving families or minors." A quiet gasp ran through the courtroom, followed by silence. Patricia stood slowly. She looked smaller than before, as if the years had already begun to weigh on her. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke, not loud, not firm, but audible enough. "I didn't know. He was the son of a prosecutor," she whispered, almost more to herself than to anyone else. It wasn't an excuse, it wasn't a defense, it was a slip, a final unfiltered truth. The implication hung in the air like smoke. If I had known, I might have been more careful. If he had belonged to someone important. That was when the judge leaned forward, his face hardening not with anger, but with something colder, disappointment. "You should have remembered," he said, his voice ringing out clear and heavy. He was someone's son. That should have been enough. The weight of the words fell across the courtroom like a gavel itself. For a moment, no one moved. Those 12 words would be quoted in editorials, social media posts, and legal blogs across the country. They became the closing line in documentaries, the final slide in news segments, the headline that outlived the verdict. He was someone's son, and that, not his father's title, not his race, not his perceived value in society, was reason enough never to lay a hand on him, never to drag him into a van, never to abandon him like garbage because he didn't match someone's idea of community decorum. Kevin didn't react. He sat in the second row, jaw set, hands clasped. He didn't need to stand. He didn't need to speak. Justice had already spoken louder than he ever could. Patricia Griffin was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Her pearls were gone. Her silence, however, remained. She never looked back, and the world she'd once ruled never looked the same again. They didn't stay in the old neighborhood. There was nothing left for them there. No more familiar sidewalks, no more hushed HOA meetings, no more clipped hedges hiding clipped voices. Kevin had made his stand, seen justice through to the end, and when it was done, he and Jaden quietly packed up their lives and left. No press, no statements, no drama. Just boxes, a moving truck, and a shared understanding that healing sometimes requires new ground. Their new house wasn't big. It didn't sit behind a gate or come with a monthly packet of rules disguised as community care. It didn't have a clubhouse or a board or a hotline to report unpleasant disturbances. What it did have was sunlight, big open windows, a backyard with patches of wild grass Jaden refused to mow because he liked the bees, a kitchen with a crooked counter and a front porch that creaked when you stepped just right. It was imperfect, which is exactly why it was perfect. And most importantly, there was no HOA. Kevin didn't talk about the past often, not because he wanted to forget, but because he wanted Jaden to move forward without being defined by the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Still, in little moments, the legacy of what they had survived made its way into their everyday life, not as a burden, but as a quiet reminder of strength. Above the hallway light switch, next to the thermostat, hung a framed photograph. It showed Jaden on stage at his school's youth rights conference, standing tall behind a podium, wearing a simple black t-shirt with the words, "My Voice Matters," written in bold white letters. His hands were mid-gesture, his mouth open in mid-sentence. But it was the look in his eyes that struck anyone who saw it, a mix of calm, courage, and clarity far beyond his years. He had spoken that day about protections for minors, about dignity, and about what it means to grow up in a world where silence is often demanded instead of understanding. He didn't name names. He didn't mention what had been done to him. He just told the truth, his truth. And in doing so, gave others permission to share theirs. Kevin had taken the photo himself. He passed it every day, often without stopping. But tonight, something made him pause. Jaden was sitting on the floor nearby, half buried in a pile of school papers, a dog-eared history book open beside him, and a pencil behind his ear. He looked up as Kevin leaned against the wall and tilted his head toward the photo. "You believe it now?" Kevin asked, his voice soft. "That one person can change the system?" Jaden smiled, not the smile of a kid being polite, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly what he believes. "One person," he said. "With a really good dad?" He nodded. "Absolutely." Kevin didn't answer right away. He just let the moment settle, warm and unshakable like sunlight on worn hardwood. Outside, the sky was beginning to shift into its evening colors, and the wind moved through the trees without permission, without regulation, without code, just free. The fight was over, but something better had taken its place. Not fame, not legacy, just life. Real, imperfect, hopeful life. And for the first time in a long time, both of them could finally breathe.